What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. Today's video topic, completely custom made seat lines. So whether you got a swap car and the AC lines don't bolt up, you got an X race car that's a little bit more of a street duty vehicle now, or you got a completely factory car and the AC lines are just ugly. If you want to build custom hoses, this video is going to tell you how to do it. Our test mule for today's video is my 2004 IS300 with a 2JZ GTE swap. Now while this engine is extremely similar to the OEM engine, and we are running the OEM AC compressor, I've changed everything else. So we're running an aftermarket condenser and we're running all new hoses. We take the OEM lines and we modify them to make everything work, and that's exactly what I'm gonna show you guys how to do. I'm gonna walk you through each component of the system, tell you what you need, where it needs to go, where you can go to find it, and how it's all gonna come together. The first component on our list is the evaporator. Now the evaporator mounts typically on the firewall. Sometimes you'll see it outside the firewall, like in this area over here, Ford Rangers S10, stuff like that. Its main job is to cool the inside of the cabin. The blower motor will blow air over the evaporator through its core. It'll come out the other side and it will super cool the cabin, giving you the air conditioned effect. And that is our starting point for the system. We're gonna have our factory lines come out of there and we're going to adapt them to our aftermarket hoses. The next component in our lineup is the compressor. Now this one's a little bit hard to see. You can kind of see a fitting here. I'll try to reach in and show it to you. Here is my hand here, and this is one of the ports on the compressor. The compressor is going to have two ports, an inlet and an outlet. It's going to come from the evaporator into that compressor, and then out of that compressor into our condenser, which is the next item on the list. AC condensers can vary in shape and size, but they're always going to be at the front of the car, and there's a lot of different options depending on your application. Now this is an aftermarket condenser, so it has what's called an integrated dryer, and it has universal type fittings, which means it's a little bit easier to build our hoses. After the condenser, we're gonna come out at the bottom. It's always gonna be in from the compressor at the top and then out at the bottom because we're condensing from a gas to a liquid, so it uses gravity to help it fall to the bottom. And we're going to go out of there and back to our evaporator. But first, we need to go through a dryer or an accumulator. This is an aftermarket condenser and it has an integrated dryer, so it saves us one potential leak point, and it's a little bit more compact than like an aftermarket dryer might be. A lot of OEM condensers do have integrated dryers like this too, especially nowadays. So, you may be able to have a setup that looks like this that uses OEM mounts and OEM fittings, but that is something to think about. The dryer has to be here, and if it's not going to be on your condenser, you're going to come out of your condenser and go into your dryer or accumulator. Both names work, depends on what application it is. Once you come out of that dryer, you are going to go back to the evaporator, and that is the basic route of the system that we will be building. While that's the basic gist of it, there are going to be a few more components that need to be added to our lines. Primarily a high pressure switch. This is going to go on the high side, and this regulates the compressor. So if it sees really high pressure, it's going to shut the compressor off. Something like 400 PSI would be too much, and it's going to save your system from exploding. We're also going to need to be able to charge the system. So with that, we have our low side or our low pressure charge port and our high side or high pressure charge port. These are going to go on opposite sides of our AC compressor. This will typically go on the suction side, and then this will go on the opposite side. Now let's talk about our hoses and fittings. So here we've got some OEM hoses that were cut off where I stole the factory fittings from. This probably looks familiar, you've probably seen it before. We got our low side charge port, we have a bit of a damper here, and then some factory line. Over here, we've got our factory compressor fittings. We've got some universal fittings. In this case, these are for my condenser. And then we have our factory evaporator fittings. Lastly, we have some universal weld fittings. Now these fittings come in different sizes depending on which line they're for or which hose you're replacing, and they weld to the end. So you can see I've cut these where it's ideal for me and my application, and then we're basically just gonna prep this and weld that on. And now we can crimp a universal type hose to this hose end and go wherever we need to go. The same thing applies to our compressor fittings. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky because there's a lot of different compressors out there. There's a lot of different options. You can buy aftermarket fittings. They call them aftermarket compressor peanuts, billet adapter fittings, depending on who you're buying them from. They have different names. But basically, you're gonna have a specific fitment here that allows for an O-ring to slide over it. And these are going to be bolted down to the compressor inlet and outlet. And then, the refrigerant flows in and out just like it would. These are the hardest thing to find sometimes if you have a really niche application. So rather than trying to find a billet fitting that looks really nice, since you can't see them a lot of the time, or maybe they're just not available, you can take an OEM fitting and adapt it, which is what we're gonna do here. With that, I've purchased my weld-on fittings accordingly. So I measured my factory size of my line, and then you can go on and you can see which one you need based on that. So in this case, this one's gonna go on here like this. Same thing for this, so on and so forth. Once we have all of our weld fittings onto our factory type lines, we can just connect the dots with hose, mark them, take them, and get them crimped. Now I know these lines have already been cut, but if you're looking at your factory lines and you want to do exactly what we're doing, you don't know where to start, just make sure you give yourself enough room. For example, I cut this thing all the way down here. I can always cut more of the fitting off later. But let's say this went right here just like this. That's great. I have everything that I need. If I want to cut it down to right here where my thumb is, that's fine, I can do that. I can't add back material, I don't want to have to. So when you're getting started, just cut them off with all the room that you possibly can to leave yourself the space. You don't need to save things like this, these are unnecessary in the system, so don't worry about that. And then things like elbows and whatever, just pull them off if you need them. If you don't, throw them away. Another thing you're going to want to salvage from the factory lines is your factory pressure switch. Now the main reason for doing this is that the plug is already the same. You don't have to change anything. If you have a custom application like vintage air or whatever and you want to redo it all, that's different, that's fine. You can buy an inline one, you can wire it yourself. But this one is nice because it plugs right into my OEM wiring. So I just assume use it and make my life a little bit easier. Also, if I need to replace the pressure switch, I can just go on and buy an OEM switch, thread it in, and call it a day. With that being said, we're gonna have to adapt this, so it does create an extra step. You have to weld fittings on both sides, whereas if you bought an aftermarket one, it may already come with crimpable hose ends on it. So this one's gonna go like this. It goes on the high pressure line. We're gonna use the smaller diameter hose, and that'll basically look something like that, although a bit cleaned up, of course. Now let's talk standard barrier and reduced barrier AC hose. There are two different types. Standard is a much larger diameter. Reduced barrier is what we're looking at here. Reduced is the move 100%. I can't really think of an application where you want to buy standard barrier unless it's like some military spec Humvee that has AC in the middle of nowhere and you can't service it and you need the extra thickness of the line, because that's the only difference. Basically, the ID is the exact same, but these ones are lighter because they have much less outer diameter, much smaller outer diameter. I wish I had one to compare for you, but I stopped using that shit a long time ago because it is maybe like $1 cheaper per foot, if that, and it's a lot heavier and you can't flex it as much. And for our applications in automotive and clean engine bays and routing that you can't see, reduced barrier hose is the way to go. So that's the only thing you should even consider, in my opinion. I do want to add, we're talking about R134A and R1234YF lines specifically. If you have a different application with R12, it's basically the same setup, but you're going to use different hose, and I'm not familiar with that because I've never done an R12 setup. So we've got all our fittings and I've got all my hoses, but how did I figure out what sizes to order? Well, it's pretty simple, and you can use coldhose.com to explain everything for you. I'm going to link in the description below, but here on their website, they explain exactly what size you need and why you need it. So basically, we have our 6, our 10, our 8, and our 12. And the reason it's out of order is because they're explaining it to you in the way it will be installed or the way that it gets used in the system. So we got our liquid line, our suction hose, our high pressure, and our other suction hose. Now this is all explained here, but I do highly recommend measuring as well, just to make sure you're not wrong. I've never really seen any variability from this website, but just to make sure you do it right, grab a caliper, measure your factory evaporator fittings, measure your pressure port, whatever it is you got to measure, go ahead and measure it and double check it, and make sure that these weld fittings will fit over. With all of our fittings, hoses, and sizes sorted out, we're ready to start mocking things up in the engine bay and get a general idea of the new hose layout. So go ahead and grab your evaporator fittings, and remember that you haven't trimmed them yet, hopefully, so they're going to be a bit longer than mine since mine have already been cut to fit. Now is the point where if you left them too long, you're going to know right away. So I'm going to pull my adapter fitting off, we don't need that yet. And we're just gonna take our evaporator fittings and set them in place. It's also a good idea to leave the old O-rings on your fittings because it helps hold things in place so they're not swiveling around super loose, at least for the mock-up phase. You don't wanna put new O-rings on until the very end. So if you have some, just hold out, don't use them yet. So now I've got my evaporator fittings in place and they're pointing in a pretty good direction. Let me show you what that looks like a little bit closer. We're pretty much in position where I want them. I'm gonna slide the weld fittings over so you can get an idea of where it's gonna make the hose land. This is the time you're gonna do your first initial trim. If your lines haven't been cut at all, they're probably gonna go somewhere into here or whatever. Go ahead and get a rough idea of where you want them to be and then measure 2 inches forward of that and cut them. When you cut them, you can use anything from an angle grinder to a pipe cutter to a bandsaw. It doesn't really matter. Just remember with aluminum, if it gets caught in a bandsaw, it can bend the line or tear it or do some damage to it. If you use something like this, it's gonna leave a little bit of an inside edge that then needs to be opened up. So if you have a tool like this, you can do that. But I prefer the angle grinder. I think that's the best option. And these are actually gonna get welded all the way to it. That's why I cut them down so short. I just wanted to get this thing to where I could use it for physical mock-up. So let's say you went and you cut your lines, you got them fitted like this, and they look like mine in a lot of ways. Now you can take your weld fittings and slide them over to get an idea of where the hose is gonna route. Now I know this one fits a little too loose for me to do it with one hand on camera, but I'm gonna take the bigger one that fits a little bit tighter and slide it over here. There we go. And now you can kind of see where it places the hose or the kind of hose route that we're going to be looking at with that position. Now this is what's important because you don't want to cut this, let's say up here, and then it makes your hose point down and your hose needs to go forward so much that that's an unfavorable angle. So you're gonna have to mess around with it a little bit to get the ideal scenario. But again, just wait and cut it down as slow as you can. Work up to it, unless you're super experienced. For you guys that do a ton of fabrication and stuff, this obviously probably seems a bit rudimentary, but for the guys that are doing it for the first time, just take your time so that you figure out where the hose needs to route before you actually cut it, and that way you're not trying to add back material. Once these two are in place, I've got my bottom one set up so it sits almost directly parallel to my top one. It's just an aesthetic thing, and they don't touch, which is nice. And they're just gonna route forward and go to the compressor, which leads us to our next set of fittings. For the compressor fittings, it's obviously the exact same thing. Grab your two fittings, grab your two adapters. I'm gonna go set them in place on the compressor and see what it looks like angle-wise. The same rule applies here. If you got shitty old O-rings on there, leave them on. It's nice to help you hold the fitting in place. Drop that fitting in there. If you have bolts and you need them, you can put them in so that the fitting doesn't spin because you don't want to change direction so much that the hose doesn't line up. And you can grab your adapter fittings, slide those over, and kind of see what the layout's going to be. I haven't trimmed these ones down enough yet, so we may need to make some modifications to mine as well. So I know it's hard to see the compressor, but for this step, you got your weld fittings, go ahead and grab a Sharpie, and we're gonna basically just eyeball the route of the hose that's gonna work and go from there. So if I slide it on, I can see kind of where the hose wrap's gonna go. I obviously need to come up here forward to our condenser. I need to think about when I come back, where's my pressure switch gonna be? Am I gonna be in the way of the pressure switch? If I don't have an integrated dryer, is the dryer going to mount on my frame rail? Is that gonna cause a restriction with routing? Basically, we just wanna make sure we don't obstruct our route before we actually build our route. This fitting looks pretty good right there. So I'm not gonna trim it. If I was, I'd mark that cut now. I'm gonna mark it just a straight line so I know to weld it there. And I will tack it and check it first. I'm not just gonna wing it the whole way through. I wanna make sure it's right. And then for the fitting that goes back to the evaporator, that's gonna be our bigger line over here with the bigger fitting on it. This one's a little bit more challenging. It may need to be trimmed a little bit just so it points up. The less stress you put on these hoses, the better. The reduced barrier is a lot more flexible, as I said before, but you still don't want to put tension on the hose that doesn't need to be there. That looks pretty good. Now let's move on to our condenser. Now for me, and those of you that are using a universal type condenser, they're almost always going to be number 8 on the top and number 6 on the bottom. So you can just buy generic fittings. They have them in 120 degree, 45 degree, 90, like this, and straight. Whatever size it is, you know, you buy what you need. You can buy a couple extras. They're like 10 to 12 bucks a fitting. Sometimes it's nice to have a pile of them, and that way you can figure out all your routing. Now these do come with brand new O-rings on them. If you want to save the O-ring so you're not tearing it up by constantly test fitting, pull it off, set your fitting in. Mine's a little bit tight to my core support, but it does clear. I'm gonna go ahead and thread this nut all the way tight. Because this thing's held on by the nut, we don't need to worry about the O-ring staying in there to hold everything still. Get that nice and snug. It'll be allowed to rotate just a hair, and then we can put the bottom one on too. My bottom one is going to aim upwards. This one obviously points down, and our two hoses are gonna come together and then run towards the back of the car. Here you can kind of see that lower one in place pointing upwards, and the two will just come together and go back. Now that we have our fittings in place, we're ready to move on and test fit our hose routes. Now if you are using an OEM condenser, you're gonna have to take the same steps we did for our evaporator and our compressor and cut them down to the appropriate lengths and then use the appropriate size weld fitting in place. This does take a little bit longer, but where you save time is you don't actually have to mount your condenser like I did, so it's really about the same time overall when you break it all down. To route the hoses, we want to set them in our fittings and make sure they're bottomed out, and then just let them lay in the direction that they're going to go. For our compressor and our evaporator, once you have your fittings marked, you can go ahead and tape them on. Now I'm going to do that now. That way we have all of our weld fittings in the proper position. And this is so that we can figure out if we're right about where we think our hoses are going to land. For example, let's say my angle on that bigger diameter one is wrong and it runs the hose into the shock tower and I can bend it, but I don't like the way it looks. I'll be happy I didn't weld it. So I'm going to pull each one off, throw a little wrap of painter's tape around it, and then put it back in place. I got my painter's tape here, and we're just going to cut off or tear off little pieces and wrap it around. You can use whatever tape you want, but if you're going to weld them, you definitely don't want to use anything with a ton of adhesive. It's just to give you like an eyeball. It doesn't have to be crazy. You don't want to knock it off, so you know, wrap it around good, but use your discretion here. Like this too, you can see how it can flex back and forth. It doesn't look like a lot, but over at the end of the route of that hose, it could be enough to make it hit something. So we just want to make sure we get it really, really dialed in. I'm also going to test fit them again after they're tack welded. Now that we got these taped, let's put them back in place and we'll bring some hose with us. So we got our fittings taped up. You can see our compressor fittings mostly in place right there. And then on my evaporator fittings, I already know I'm gonna wanna make a change. You can see right now they're aiming pretty much straight at the shock tower. While I could spin them over to get a more straight route without making any other changes, I like the proximity I have to the intake manifold, so I'm probably gonna try to bend those lines a little bit and take some of that angle out so that they have a straighter shot going this direction here. For now, I'm gonna go ahead and grab my upper hose. It's gonna go off the front of the compressor to the top of the condenser. We'll test fit that one first. Now this hose is gonna be our number 8 size. So I've got that ready. I'm gonna fish it through here, get it mocked up. So I've got my hose bottomed out in the front compressor fitting. We're all the way up in the fitting itself. Nothing is torn. Be careful not to knock the tape off, is where it does kind of have to be a little bit sturdy. Then we're gonna just loop the hose around, try to make sure it has no tension on it, and get a rough idea where the hose is gonna go. Now I'm gonna cut the hose down, but I'm gonna give myself plenty of length to make adjustments. I think I like it, but until I see it inside both fittings, I don't know for certain. And I'm gonna trim it down with a big old pair of AN cutters. Now, one thing you can use that I don't have on hand right now is PVC pipe cutters. They're ratcheting, they're a lot smaller, easier to use with one hand, but this is what I have, so that's what I'm gonna use for the moment. And it cuts right through it, no problem. Just a little bit nicer when you can use a handheld set of PVC cutters. Okay, our hose nice and slid up. We wanna bottom it out. And the way you know it's bottomed out, there's a small hole right here on the shell of the fitting. And when you push it up, you'll see it through the hole. So before that, I can see there's nothing there. And you watch it slide in as it's bottomed out. Now you can see it's way too long. We have tons of slack, but that's okay. We can always trim it down. We cannot add it back. And then we're just gonna look at it and make sure that the hose isn't binding anywhere and that it's got nice clearance everywhere and things look like they're gonna work out. That's basically all we're doing. I'm pretty happy with this routing overall. Comes up nice and clean. There's no stress on the hose. All I have to do to make it fit better is take length out. There will not be any fitting adjustments. So I can go ahead and tack weld that compressor fitting, and we can move on to our high pressure line so that we can locate our pressure switch on our frame rail. I just mentioned tacking one fitting, but because mine are all really close, I'm gonna go ahead and tack all of them. You can do that now at this stage if you want, but I already know kind of where I wanna be. I got them a little closer off camera. And then I went ahead and prepped them all with a 3M Scotch-Brite, like a roll-lock pad on the end of a die grinder. You wanna get all the contaminants out. Obviously the new ones aren't gonna be nearly as dirty, but things like the inline pressure switch housing, this thing's gonna have a lot of crap inside it. So try to clean it out the best you can, because when you weld it, all that stuff will come up through, and it's different than welding anything else. You might weld like an oil pan or something like that, and you notice the oil residue, but old refrigerant is a different game. So just make sure you clean them the best you can. And I use acetone for that, so I'm gonna wipe all these fittings down, get them all tacked, and we'll go back to our engine bay. All right, check it out. We went ahead and tacked everything, and then I went ahead and fully welded the pressure switch. The biggest problem with welding fittings together, which is what all of you are gonna do if you do this, or if you braze them, you know, that's an option, but once they're connected and they've been heated up, you can't heat them up again because you're gonna put a hose in there and crimp it, and then when you go to vacuum test it, if it leaks, you have to remake the entire thing. So it's not ideal. You can cut these shells off and reshell them, and that's kind of a different topic altogether, but you know, depending on who's TIG welding it for you, if they're real experienced, there shouldn't be a problem. It's just a little challenging because we have such a thin piece right here going to such a thick piece here. A lot of heat has to go into that, and it can be a little bit tough not to burn through. Same thing goes for these right here where you have a little bit of overlap. You can see where we have a bit of a gap right there where it slides over. And we're ready to let them cool a little bit, and then we'll set them in the bay, double check all our hose routings, and see what it looks like. Now for the next step, we want to go ahead and cut all of our hoses to length, or at least to our rough length. We don't have to crimp them yet, so you can adjust them a little. So now that we've got our pressure switch ready to go, we know where it's going to go on the rail for the most part. We want to go ahead and build, in my case, I'm going to build the first line, the one coming off the compressor and going to the top of the condenser. The reason for this is because this line can't change much no matter where I put my pressure switch. It's pretty much got to be this way. So we're going to just get it marked, get it cut, and get it installed so that we can use it as a placeholder for that specific hose. First hose is in place, runs back down right across the rail, right over to here, and right in that nice shiny new compressor fitting we got there. So now we're going to come out of the bottom of our condenser here, get that number 6 fitting pointing up. We're going to try to group that hose with the other one, make it nice and clean, then find a home for the pressure switch on this driver's side frame rail here. Now there will be some of you where the best situation for your pressure switch is really far away from where it is from the factory. You might want to put it over there, you might be moving your condenser. There's all kinds of things. If you need to do that and you're using the factory pressure switch, you can just lengthen the wires. Sometimes you'll have 4, sometimes you'll have 3, maybe even 2. If so, just lengthen them and put it where you want. For me, the factory switch is already over here and the wiring hasn't changed because we're not changing our route. So I'm going to go ahead and put it somewhere on that rail. I got my lower hose running to my pressure switch. I got the switch roughly where I want it on the frame rail. It's just floating there. It's not finish mounted, of course. That is one thing you can do ahead of time if you want to have a more certain hose routing, is permanently mount the pressure switch where you want it. We're going to put this hose in here. This is the final hose to the evaporator for the smaller line, for the high pressure side. And that'll give you a better idea now when you look down which way your hose is actually gonna go. Once you have it in both sides, it's the only way to truly know, how it's gonna fit. Worst case scenario, if they're aluminum, which unless you're doing a really old car, it'll all be aluminum, you can bend them. We got one hose left to do. It's going to be the line from the evaporator to the compressor, the biggest hose, the number 10. Another thing to note quickly is that sometimes when the hose gets sent to you, it will not be cut straight. And then when you go to put it in the crimp shell, it's not in there straight. So just go ahead and cut everything straight before you start working with it. That way you don't accidentally cut the other side when you're setting your length and you end up with a slash cut hose like this that's not actually gonna work that well, and it could actually leak too. The hose is a little bit difficult to deal with because it's got a natural curve to it from how it was stored and then shipped and all those things. So you're gonna wanna try to build the hose to work with that curve so you're not putting it against itself all the time. It's just gonna make the hose, basically wanna bow out or fight itself. There's no reason for that. This one looks pretty good. We got it in the evaporator. I'm gonna try to aim the curve down. You can see right now it's actually up. So I wanna rotate the hose a little bit. And again, when it's long, it's harder to do because we got all this hose outside the engine bay that we don't need. So I'm gonna trim it first. This can be considered a little bit wasteful, but I won't really be able to get the hose into a position where I can mark it perfectly unless I cut it down. So you just gotta kind of take the risk, cut your losses a little bit on a couple feet of cut hose. There we go, much more manageable, and now you can clearly see the curve. Now I can definitely see that it would help me if I bent my fitting off the compressor up a little bit. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about change-wise. You wanna have the option to make. The outlet has quite a bit of adjustment on it from that single tack. That helped a lot. I think I'm happy with that, enough to mark the hose down at least to where it will fit. Again, leaving enough slack to make mistakes. Try to give you the best version of this that I can. It's a really difficult setup to see, which is great for aesthetics. But you can see the pressure switch in there a little bit. Wiring harness is kind of sticking off the side. It's not exactly the final landing point. That'll all be decided when we crimp them. And that one coming off the compressor, coming up. All right, well, in the middle of that last clip, the battery in the camera died and I lost the entire 2-minute clip of building the last two hoses. So whatever, we got our smaller high pressure line in, and then I cut down the number 10 hose to also fit from the final compressor fitting, the one pointing this direction, going up to our evaporator. Now that hose is too long, and as you can see, it shouldn't be visible right here, at least not like that, but I cut the hose too long and that's fine. I'll reduce it once we get it sorted, but this gives us enough of an idea of which way our hoses are gonna go, bend, twist, so on and so forth, so that we can make our necessary changes before anything is finalized. I don't think I really need to make many changes. I like the way the hoses look, but now is the time to do so. We could do things like pull this over like that, gives us a more straight route, kind of looks nice, but it also looks cool when you look from the top that these two fittings are in parallel. So if we pull this over, we'll change that. Maybe that's not something we want, I don't know. For me, I want to keep them how they are, but for you, this is the time to think about it. So now we're gonna go ahead and pull all these fittings back off, take them over to the table, get them finished welded, and then we can reinstall them one final time, get all of our hoses in place, and get our lengths perfect, make sure everything's dialed, and we can mark them so that they can be crimped. All right, everything's finished welded. Came out pretty good for the most part. We can now go ahead and throw all this stuff back in place for a final fitment check. We're gonna cut our hoses for their final install, perfect length, all of it's gonna get done right now. And then I'll show you how to mark them so that you can take them to your local hose shop to have them crimped, or you can crimp them on their own. And then after that, the only thing left to do is vacuum the system down, make sure we don't have any leaks, and then charge it, and we're good to go. Now we're ready to mark the hose, and when you do this, I like to use black Sharpie. Intuitively, you might want to use white or silver, and that's fine, but I like black because it's harder to see on the hose, and if for any reason you can't get it off the hose, at least it's black so it's not very visible, whereas like a white or silver line would really stand out. I like to mark my shell over to my hose, just a straight line, basically like this, and just straight across onto our hose, and that way if it moves in transport, when they go to crimp it, they'll line the two Sharpie lines up, and you're good to go. You wanna go ahead and mark every single spot, and then when you pull it out, be very careful so you don't pull the hose out of your shell. Sometimes it feels pretty tight, but other times it's surprisingly loose in there. Again, you're also, as I'm doing this, I'm pushing the hose into the shell, making sure it bottoms out so we don't have a hose that's this far from the bottom and not fully seated in the fitting. Now that we have all of our lines removed, it's easier to see what I was talking about the curvature of the hose in regard to your marks. Now, if you're gonna transport these and go to like a hose shop, somewhere that does hydraulic fittings can typically crimp these. It is a different crimper, but normally those guys can do it. You wanna call around and see. But before you do, you wanna tape your fittings together. I typically use painter's tape, again, just because it doesn't have that much adhesive, and you wanna tape everything together. So if you throw all these in a box, they don't all come apart and you don't know which one went where. For me, I thankfully have a crimper here. It is a manual crimper, so it's not the best, but it works pretty well. It's a master tool unit, and it can do standard and reduced because I have multiple dies for this. So we're gonna go ahead and bang them all out. All right, check it out. After maybe 20 minutes with the manual crimper, everything is crimped and done. All of my marks line up. I'm ready to throw these things back in for a final test fit. Now I'm gonna paint my fittings, so everything that you see that's silver is gonna be black. There are people that argue you shouldn't do that so the lines can breathe. But in my opinion, you have all this hose right here. I'm not too worried about this much aluminum here. I just don't care. I've painted them black in the past and never had problems. And then one more thing to mention is that if you have any of these hoses running in a hot spot, for example, past the turbo manifold, you're gonna wanna wrap them in like a fiberglass heat sleeve, and you should do that before you get them crimped. I'm talking about hose that looks like this right here. You got a couple different sizes for various stuff. And you wanna find the right size depending on which hose diameter you're using, and then cut it and slide it over before it's crimped. And a lot of times the guys at the hose shop will be familiar with this, so you can just tell them, hey, I gotta pull this hose back, and you can scrunch it up and zip tie it out of the way, and that way they're able to crimp it with no restrictions. Then you slide it back at the end, and everybody's happy, and your hose is nice and protected. Well, holy shit. The lines are great, but I made a huge mistake. And if you've been looking in the background of any of these clips, you may have noticed it before I noticed it, but somehow I crimped all of our lines without adding our beloved pressure ports. This is a massive mistake. Do not do this. Use my mistake to save yourself from the problem that I now face. This is crazy, and I could just cut this out and sweep it under the rug and leave it, but I think it's better to show that this can still happen. I built a shitload of these lines. This is like, it used to be my thing. Obviously, that's why I'm showing you how to do it. But it's been a while, and I just got excited to get them done, and somehow I overlooked it. So what we were going to do originally is just not crimp this side. All I had to do was not crimp this, and not crimp this one here, and then add these fittings. This one was gonna go here somewhere, this one was gonna go here somewhere, and we would have been good to go. Now I have two options. I've already decided what I'm gonna do, but if for some reason you're faced with a similar scenario, one, I could cut the shell off, being very careful not to cut the hose behind it, which it is possible, and then you can actually pull the fitting off. You can re-shell it and then re-crimp it, but I would have to go get a new shell. I don't have them. I'd have to go to the hose shop. It adds an element of time wasted to do that. Or I could cut off both sides, throw the hose away, and reuse some of this spare hose that I got here. I have enough hose in both sizes to redo it. Then I would need two shells. I don't really see what the advantage is there. The only difference is I could cut these off faster. Not gonna do that, I don't think. Or option three, which I've never done this, but I've done some research and apparently it is possible. I could, and again, I don't know. I'm just saying, thinking out loud, I guess. I could submerge this in water to like right here. We'll get it ready and then maybe tack it, and then we'll submerge this in water so that all the heat goes out into the water and doesn't heat the hose up so we don't melt it, because if we tried to weld this without doing that, it's a big problem. It will not work. Oh, this is a nightmare. I'm sorry, this is not part of the plan. I guess I did show you how to build the hoses, so you got that, but I'd like to finish it off in this video and show you how it properly is done. So I'll do that no matter what it takes, but I'm going to try my best to reinstall them, mark our charge ports, drill our holes, get them in place, and see if we can submerge the hose end. Of course, just to here, so this side will get grounded and welded. We'll just be near the water. It'll pull some heat out and hopefully save us from ruining our hose. Before I jump right into ruining my hoses, I need to prep these fittings to be welded. So we're gonna pull the valve cores out. Just use a regular AC valve core tool. Just wanna pull these guys out. They have little O-rings on them, and if you get them hot, it'll definitely ruin them. And then you wanna write on them too, so that you don't get confused with where they go. Here we go. Now you'll notice I've got my charge ports here because I need to know the total size constraints or space required. These you could accidentally put in the wrong spot, but as far as how the ports go, the way this is designed, you can't put the low on the high or the high on the low. They'll only go on with each other. So this pops in like that. And the reason we need this is because where we're gonna put it depends on how much space we have for this entire assembly here. All right, we're in place there. I'll try to show you guys this from a better angle. So basically, we're talking about putting this one something like that, and this one something like this. It looks like that'll work. So we're gonna go with that. So now that you've seen exactly how we locate these things, I'm gonna go ahead and get them marked, take them off, drill them, prep them, pray. That's the plan. I got both my ports marked and I'm starting to drill my holes. I'm gonna put the port there. When you drill these out, I used like a 7/16 or a 7/64, I'm sorry, drill bit first, just to get my hole started. Use one of these to get the hole initiated, and then went from there. And I'm just gonna work my way up until the fitting just slides right in. You can see it's got a nice tip on it, and that's all that needs to drop in there. The rest of this will sit outside of the line. And you do not want to push really hard or use a step bit or anything like that, because it's very easy to go through the other side and you have a bigger problem than I have right now. So good luck to you. I'm going to drill these out completely, get these fitted up, and I'll meet you guys on the welding table with my bucket of water. In the event that I completely ruin these, I want to show you guys just how good my port fitment was before I do. Look at this. Bam. For this first one, we've got it wrapped in 3 waterlogged towels, and all I'm doing is tacking it. All right, it worked. It wasn't amazing, but it worked. We did get it tacked. So now I'm gonna try to set up the bucket method, and then we're just gonna submerge this thing, and I don't know, we'll see. So I know this may seem a bit ridiculous, but remember, if I don't fix this, I ruin the hose basically. So I'm trying to go to somewhat extreme lengths to not have to do that. I don't really need it to be any higher than right here, so. Look at this monstrosity. It actually should work pretty well, but it is a little bit intimidating to pick up this much water and put it on the table and then know that we're gonna strike an arc right next to it. I'm holding it now because as I'm welding it, the bucket's getting hotter and it's starting to collapse. So I will hold it, let the bucket re-harden or cool down, and then we'll go again. All right guys, well I tried to weld the second one as well, and it's all right, it's not terrible, but it's definitely not exactly what I want. But I do have another one of these fittings. So I think the smart move is just to cut the shell off the best I can without cutting the hose underneath it. I do have spare hose if I need to, then I gotta do 2 shells, and I don't have enough fittings to do that. So always order extra fittings, right? I'm putting all this in hopefully to, I don't know, entertain you and also help you not make the same mistakes. It's kind of ironic to make one in a how-to, but whatever, it happens. So I'm gonna cut this off right there and then just re-weld this new one on. And while it's obviously off, I'll weld this fitting all the way around. Because trying to submerge this when I gotta weld the top and stuff, like, how's that gonna work? You know, it doesn't, so. I didn't go all the way through, but it was pretty close. You can see I just popped it the rest of the way. Oh, I did. All right, we got our fitting fully welded now, and it was so much easier to just weld this thing without worrying about where I was relative to my bucket of water. So, yeah, glad that's over. Grab my marker, mark it up, get it cut down, re-crimp it, get them prepped. I'm gonna paint them, I'll show you that. Then we'll get them installed, we'll vacuum it down, and we're finally back to where we should be. And we just wasted about 3-4 hours of our time. We are ready to install the lines. They are black, they are dry, and they are fully reassembled. They came out great. I really like how subtle the black looks. And the last 2 things to do before you install them is make sure your valve core straighter valves are installed, and you want to get all your O-rings in place. So pressure port, compressor, evaporator, condenser, all the connections. Just take a little bit of engine oil. Hopefully use fresh O-rings. I need to go match this and figure out which size I need. Then just take a little bit of clean engine oil and dip the O-ring in it, clean it off. Not so much that it's dripping, but just so much that when you tighten it, it doesn't tear the O-ring. And then we can put them all in place, get them all nice and tight, and charge our system. When you're getting your replacement O-rings, the best way to guarantee they're gonna fit properly is to go to the dealership or online, but to buy them specifically for your make and model, or your aftermarket compressor, or your condenser. The condenser itself is easy if it's generic because they're gonna be universal number 8 and number 6 O-rings. If it's OEM, again, OEM part numbers are gonna be the best just to guarantee they don't leak. You can also get a universal O-ring kit like this. This is for AC stuff specifically, that's why they're green. And I've had good luck doing this. It is possible to put the wrong size in. It might be slightly too small or a different diameter and it will leak. But if you're careful, you should have good results. Once you've found the O-ring you need, this is the one we're gonna use for our pressure port here. Just take a cap from like an oil container, fill it with some clean engine oil, and take the O-ring and dip it in. Just let the oil run all over it. And you can even let a little drip off if you feel like it's too much, and then just slide it over your port or your fitting or whatever it is, and you're good to go. And just like that, all the lines are back and installed, everything's in place. Came out really clean. On the firewall here, you can see where the evaporator connections are made. I used a nice little like fender bolt. I had a spare one of these sitting around, so feel free to do that if you will, Yeah, so this is what it looks like, and this is why it's worth it to build custom lines, because you can do little things like that make them look so much better. For the tightening process, you just want to seat the fitting down, basically like for these front ones, right? You want to seat this down in position first, and then you want to tighten the nut in. And that's because you don't want to try to spin the O-ring very much, because you could have it at a weird angle, it could tear it. You just don't want to put it in any position where it's going to be under any sort of stress. You just want it to seal, and the nut is where all your tension needs to be. So you just want to push it in, make sure it's nice and snug, then thread your nut in, both top and bottom. And same goes for the other fittings. You just push the fitting down gently and evenly with even pressure so that it locks into place on the compressor or on the evaporator, and you run your bolt in to hold it in place. With that, I'm gonna do a quick once over off camera. We'll hook up our manifold gauge set that I got sitting over here. We'll get this thing vacuumed down, make sure it holds, make sure we don't have any leaks, test every single connection, and then we'll be ready to put some R134A in. Got my manifold gauges all set up. We're connected on both of our lines, the suction and the high pressure. We got our vacuum pump ready to go. But one more thing I wanted to add is that if you can, you want to place your high and low pressure ports somewhere that is out of the way of the serpentine belt. So, you know, I could wrap these hoses in from this side, but then they're at risk of getting sucked into the belt here at idle. And although we're just going to vacuum the system down with the engine off, when we go to charge it, we're not going to disconnect the manifold gauges. So whether you're going to a shop or you're doing it yourself, this is the process. You vacuum it down with the car off, and then when you charge it, you turn the car on so that the compressor can cycle when it sees pressure in the system. So because of that, just be aware of where you put these pressure ports. It's really nice if you don't have to worry or zip tie or anything like that, because I know that there's really no way they're going to get sucked into the belt unless someone was to push them into it. 30 inches of vacuum. All right, we got 45 minutes down under a nice long vacuum. So now I've got them shut, the pump is off. We're gonna wait another 30 minutes to an hour. And as long as these gauges don't move at all, we know that we're good. Clocking back in about 45 minutes later, and I'm very happy to say that our gauges have not moved at all. If they move even the slightest bit, it's not worth filling the system because it's just gonna leak out. Now, I have a bunch of R134A here. I like to buy it at Walmart. It is the cheapest you're ever gonna get it, from my experience, unless you have some sort of connection. I bought all these way back, as you can see by all the dust, and I paid like $4 a can. They're like double that now, but it's still a better option than Advance or something like that. So go ahead and grab some cans. You're gonna wanna look at your system and see what it's spec'd for. And then of course with custom lines, it's not gonna be quite that, but it's gonna be relatively close unless you cut your condenser size in half or do a custom evaporator or whatever. And if you do that, then just, you know, buy enough. Buy, let's say that the system is, I don't know, 1.2 pounds, or maybe it's 30 ounces or something like that. Buy a little extra, buy a couple extra cans, and that way when the time comes, you're not sitting there kicking yourself because you didn't fill it all the way up. Now, how do you know how much to put in? This is irrelevant kinda from what we're doing here with just the custom line topic, but we might as well go ahead and talk about it because it only takes a second. So let me pull up my chart here. If you're using R134A, then this is what you're gonna search, and you're gonna type in Google R134A pressure chart. Then you're gonna go to images. It's gonna pull up this trusty blue one. This is the one I like to use. And as you can see, it's gonna have your ambient temp, and it's gonna have your low pressure and your high pressure range. This is how I always do it. This is what I trust. And you know, let's see what it is outside here. Here in good old Zebulon, North Carolina, we are looking at 79 degrees. And you know, we can pick either one. We can go 75, we can go 80. I wanna go 80. We're gonna need between 40 and 50 PSI on the low side and 175 to 210 on the high side. So now, the next step is to start putting refrigerant in. We're looking at 40.6 degrees right now. That's with an outside temp of 91, 92 degrees, somewhere in there. So I'm very happy with that. And I'm gonna go ahead and shut this thing down and film the outro and get you guys ready to go make your own shit. All right, well, I know the last clips were a little tough to hear, but I had to do most of that while it was running so I could explain what's going on, show you accurate vent temps, things like that. And there we have it. We have finally come to an end with this video. I'm sorry it took this long, but I hope the trials and tribulations help you guys stay motivated even when shit hits the fan. It's not always sunshine and rainbows. We had a bunch of hurdles, we got over them, and we got it figured out. And although a 41 degree vent temp, 40 degree vent temp isn't the best, you might have some guys tell you, oh, we don't stop till we see 36. Well, that might be true. I'm very happy with this setup, and if I have to add refrigerant, I can. But that's all really bonus info anyway. Hopefully the custom line layout works for you and you're able to use what I did here to help you build your own setup. Maybe it helps you justify a swap. Maybe it makes the car more worth it to invest in. Now you can drive it more than 6 months out of the year. Maybe your girlfriend doesn't hate it, your wife doesn't hate it, your mom doesn't hate it. Whatever it is, this should make your car a little bit more desirable. Thank you guys for watching. Peace out.